A couple of different times, Betty Brown tried to work this story into one of her books, but her editor kept cutting it out. So this story makes its debut in this place with you today. It is the story of Scotty and WrestleMania. My husband Terry has had a series of little brothers from the Big Brother Big Sister program, and one's name was Scotty, and when he was on the cusp of turning 12 years old, Terry asked him what he would like for his birthday, and Scotty knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted to go to a professional wrestling match. Poor Terry. Trying to think quickly and strategically, Terry said, well, Scotty, that only lasts for a moment. Why don't we go to Toys R Us and buy you some wrestling figures that you will have forever? Scotty, who was equally quick and strategic, said, but if we go to the wrestling match, I'll have that memory forever. Well, we're talking today about rejoicing, and I don't share this story because Scotty was joyful. Scotty was happy. Believe it or not, Terry was joyful. You see, it is in humbling ourselves to build up another in relationship that joy happens. Today, we are wrapping up our month-long sermon series, Living in Community. You may be aware that your clergy staff take turns developing these series, and several months ago, I was given May. And so that week, when my home group met, I decided to ask them if they had any suggestions. Yes, Philippians. Preach from Philippians. So here we are. Now, I want to say a quick word about this home group. Clay Ralston, stand up if you would. Clay Ralston, stand up. When has Clay ever been shy? Thank you, Clay. Our home group was made up of Clay and Luana Ralston, and your compadres were at the 8:30 service, so I want to make sure they get credit. Dave and Edie Culberson and Rob and Cindy Campbell made up Muncie's inaugural home group, and nobody can ever take that away from you. There is something unique about home groups. They are small groups, yes, like other small groups, but they meet, guess where? In homes, which makes them unique and different and particularly close. It's a different kind of community. And each of those three couples and Helen Redman, who was part of Mark's staff home group, will start their own in their own homes this fall. So keep your ears peeled for that. Watch for information in the messenger and the update. Prayerfully consider being in a home group. It is truly a unique and special experience, and I will treasure, Clay, sitting around your kitchen table always. They are about community out in the community. So back to Philippians. Paul is systematic in his letter to the community in Philippi. He told us last week about his conversion experience. You know how some people have this kind of story? You think you've had it bad. Well, that's nothing. I've had it worse. Let me just tell you. And what do you want to do? Right. Right? Well, Paul tells his story a little differently and in a much more compelling way. Paul said, you think you have it all together? I hear you. I understand exactly where you are because I thought I had it all together too. I was a Hebrew among Hebrews, tribe of Benjamin. We're all about our tribes, aren't we? Proud of being part of the tribe of Benjamin. And he said when it came to the law, I was a Pharisee. I knew the law, I kept the law, and I expected everybody else to keep the law too. Tribe, law, zeal. Oh, let me just tell you, Paul said, I had zeal. I had passion. You know what I was passionate about? Persecuting the followers of Christ. Nobody could persecute the followers of Christ like I could. And then, he said, Christ got hold of me. And I had to let go of all that rule following, legalistic list checking. I had to let go in order to take hold of the one who had taken hold of me. And nothing has been the same since. Paul, the Jew who persecuted Christians, is now writing a letter to Gentiles and calling them his beloved, his joy, even his crown. He was pointing to them to the one, the followers of whom he had persecuted, and saying, be like him. Think like he does. Humble yourselves like he does. Put others ahead of yourselves like he does. Be one in spirit and purpose. His spirit and purpose. That's quite an amazing turnaround story, which gives it credibility. But Paul was no Pollyanna. He knew that even as they sought to make themselves into one, into community, that there would be conflict. And that's where we find ourselves today. 2 of the women in Philippi, and good job, Nora, on those 2 names. I'm not even going to attempt them. 2 of the women find themselves in unspecified conflict. But we can tell from what Paul says that they have been working all together as one, living and working together up to this point. They have been, as Paul says, living in Jesus. Living in Jesus means living together, where that means living at home or living at the church. Either way, it's family, right? And persons living together can grate on each other. Is that a surprise? I hope I didn't burst your bubble. It just happens. Peter used similar language when sending a letter to the people who were scattered all over, who were also seeking to live in community. And isn't it interesting? This thing about community is woven throughout Scripture. But it isn't easy. And that's one of the questions I have for God when I get to heaven. What were you thinking, having us live in community? Peter said to them, and he says to us, like living stones, let yourself be built into a spiritual house. The ongoing task of building community takes on the proportion of building the temple. No easy thing. And if we were to build a model of the temple here, listen to what happens. Do you hear it? Is it grating on your nerves? These stones grate and grind on each other, and we living stones grate on each other sometimes. Paul has a strategy for dealing with this. He says, y'all, as a paraphrase, y'all, The Lord is near. Don't worry about stuff that doesn't ultimately matter. He says with prayer and supplication. Supplication. Now that's prayer. So why does he say prayer and supplication? Because supplication is not just asking, it's begging in humility. With prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Now, I assume that Paul assumes that the requests we make known to God are for humility and harmony and unity and not the smackdown of the one who grates on our nerves. And why do I think that? Because the one who grates on my nerves is probably praying for my smackdown, and I would just assume that not happen. So Paul goes on, and when you pray like this, what will happen? Peace. Peace beyond anything you can comprehend will descend not only upon you, but within you and throughout you, among the whole community. Then Paul says, instead of thinking about how annoying your neighbor is, to think instead about everything that is just and pure and pleasing and honorable and commendable. Why? Because if we're all thinking those things, then we're all thinking like Jesus thinks. We are thinking with the mind of Christ. Paul says, rejoice. And Paul, because Paul's Paul, repeats himself. Rejoice some more. He says there is so much good going on. Don't get hung up on the stuff that bugs you. Just try this and see what happens. Nathan Eddy, a former chaplain at St. Peter's House in, get this, Manchester, England. When I wrote this, Manchester, England wasn't in the news, so I don't know whether this is coincidental or providential. Nathan Eddy says, joy always takes root amid adversity. There is no other soil for it to grow in. Why? Joy always takes root amid adversity. There is no other soil for it to grow in. I was a part of an event we had here at Muncie 3 Saturdays ago. We gathered some of the leaders of our church for an event called Unity in the Midst of Diversity, because our beloved denomination, the United Methodist Church, is in conflict. And we have no choice, we feel, as your clergy staff, but to address it. We just don't feel like we can bury our heads. We don't feel like we can say, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to talk about it. That just doesn't seem like a healthy and reasonable approach to us. It seems healthier, we think, to engage in respectful and guided conversation around the conflict. Our facilitator said something that has stuck with me these last 3 weeks, and it will stick with me forever. She said, instead of thinking, good grief, why does she say that? Or instead of, what is he doing that for? To try to change that way of thinking, and hopefully it's thinking and not actually speaking, but to change that way of thinking to wonder. I wonder what makes her say that in that way? Or I wonder, what causes him to act that way? Simple, yet for me, profound. It was a long day, 6 hours, and 7 for people like Sally and Aubrey who were facilitators that day. Yet we left that Saturday rejoicing. Not rejoicing that there is conflict, but rejoicing that we are in community and we are thankful to have each other, even if we don't have the same opinions. We are rejoicing that we can be of one spirit and one purpose. Joy always takes root amid adversity. There's no other soil for it to grow in. In our 21st century cultural context, joy is an individual response to a happy circumstance, like WrestleMania was for Scotty. That entire evening could have grated on Terry's last nerve. But more important to Terry than his aversion for grown men throwing each other around was being with Scotty, building a relationship with someone who was very different than himself. And who could have thought it would happen at Freedom Hall with men slinging each other around a ring? There are all sorts of stories that speak to this. Creation even speaks to it. And because I don't want you to leave here with WrestleMania on the brain, I want you to enjoy the story of Mason. Mason was easily annoyed and agitated. People grated on Mason. Is that a story of peace that passes understanding? A story of conflict turned to harmony. Jill Craneshaw of Wake Forest University Divinity School gives us this on which to close. Paul uses language of rejoicing both to encourage and to remind. The Christians at Philippi have a story of faith. They have experienced God's presence in their midst. Paul reminds them of this story and how it should daily characterize communal relationships. The Philippians are a people whose lives should radiate gentleness and non-anxious prayerfulness. They are a people whose thoughts should overflow with whatever is honorable, just, commendable, pure, pleasing. They are a people who, because of God's nearness, should rejoice always. Because the words of Philippians and because the words we read today are meant for us today, please hear this one more time. Paul uses language of rejoicing both to encourage and to remind. The Christians at Muncie have a story of faith. They have experienced God's presence in their midst. Paul reminds them of this story and how it should daily characterize communal relationships. The people at Muncie are a people whose lives should radiate gentleness and a non-anxious prayerfulness. They are a people whose thoughts should overflow with whatever is honorable and pure and pleasing and commendable. The people at Muncie are a people who, because of God's nearness, should rejoice always. Amen.